It's great to welcome to the program today Natalie Wynn, who is a video essayist and progressive commentator with 500,000 subscribers to her YouTube channel, Contrapoints, which I know many people in my audience, Natalie, are familiar with. You've been one of the most requested guests on the show, so I'm glad we were able to make it happen.
Oh, well, I'm glad I can be here. Hi, everyone.
So to start with, let's assume someone's not familiar with you. Your videos have a very particular style. Your background is in academia, graduate academia in philosophy, so you bring a sort of different perspective than maybe many other commentators. What's kind of your general approach? What are you trying to do with your video essays?
Well, I'd say they're kind of like political video essays, or sometimes even more like dramatic pieces that basically try to make the most difficult political controversies of our day into like sort of entertaining question, basically. So I guess I would say that as persuasion, what I'm trying to do is kind of reach like basically a mainstream YouTube audience, people who like jokes and memes and want to be entertained. But instead of doing the usual thing that you do when you want to entertain people with politics, which is, make feminist cringe compilation part 57, what I do is try to create a more like thoughtful video essay, sort of in the vein of like the kind of genre of like very well written and researched like film review that goes on YouTube, except about politics, and to keep that entertaining and engaging and funny and not taking myself too seriously.
Yeah, so we'll get into some of the specific topics you've covered, and fascism and authoritarianism is of interest to me and to my audience, so we'll get to that. But you mentioned persuasion. One of the things I think you and I agree on that maybe is different than a part of what the considers itself to be the left is the idea that just because you have the right argument from a logical perspective doesn't mean that you're going to succeed in the area of persuasion. I've actually also gone even further to say that I think sometimes you shouldn't even bother with persuasion on certain topics and with certain people. But we can maybe get to that. Can you give us some examples of where the left you feel is right logically but is unable to persuade?
Well, I think that it's a pretty common problem. I mean, I think that one thing that I come at the sort of leftist commentary from like what was called like an SJW kind of angle. That is, I was doing a lot of stuff on gender and race. And I think that, for a lot of people, that entire type what's called like what's derided as identity politics always comes across as accusatory, right? Like especially to, this seems to be this like defensive reaction that gets provoked, like in white men in particular, because the discourse around those topics tends to be on the left. It's very like sort of like you're so privileged and you did all these horrible things to us. And no one wants to hear that. So, even if it's true, if people feel that their group is being attacked or they're being attacked for the group that they belong to, they basically shut down and don't listen. Now, there are some people who will act as if that's what you're saying, even if you're saying nothing even close to that. So it's a little complicated, but I do think that when I'm making that kind of argument, I take care to do everything I can to sort of minimize that reaction of defensiveness, to always not make people feel personally attacked, but like I'm trying to help them see something in a new way rather than like coming at them like guns blazing, pointing a finger and blaming.
Yeah, the identity politics issue is interesting because I don't know if you saw a couple of months ago, there's this Black Tea Party guy, David Webb, who
Mm.
has a Sirius XM radio show, and he was interviewing some legal analyst, and it was a phone interview, so the legal analyst couldn't see him. And when the topic of white privilege came up, the legal analyst said David Webb has his show, at least in part, because of white privilege, which of course was a total faceplant since he's black, and the entire thing devolved into just a disaster. And my analysis
Yeah.
of it was, uh, if we want to make coherent and persuasive arguments about an issue like white privilege, it actually shouldn't matter what the identity of the person making the argument or receiving the argument is, because you end up in exactly these types of situations where you now are starting to argue about whether a particular person is the beneficiary or not of white privilege.
Yeah.
If you're black, of course, it's hard to make that case, but that we should instead focus on the societal impact and the underlying values and priorities. Do you think that that is a fair interpretation of where identity-based arguments can work and can fail, or is there a sort of different way you would synthesize it?
I would say that's definitely one of the things. Like, I guess, you know, even when I know, when I feel that the audience I'm talking to, if I feel that some of their sensitivities are unfair or unreasonable, I will sometimes try to be sort of cater to them anyway. Like, I spend a lot of time talking about transgender issues, and a lot of people, just the word transphobia just makes them like shut down. I
Hmm.
don't know why exactly, but I just empirically have noticed that it does. And so I'll try to find a way around saying the word transphobia, since it seems to be just a trigger word for minds closing their doors.
What's it? So what other terms do you use? I'm curious.
I will say like ignorance about trans people, for example, or disgust towards trans people, or you know, things like that.
Yeah, I've experienced that with the movement that is skeptical about vaccines, and I'm choosing my words carefully
Mm,
because I realize that there's a sort of similar, a kind of triggering effect, shutdown effect when you use the term anti-vaxxer, even if for all practical
yeah.
purposes it's a relevant and accurate term. There seems to be something similar there. Although I guess from a practical perspective, I'm curious, does avoiding the term transphobia and using the other terms actually allow you to have more productive conversations, do you think, or be more persuasive?
I think at the right moment it can. Like, I think some people, it doesn't matter, but I think what words like anti-vaxxer or transphobia do is that they're a little bit jargony. So they're sort of shibboleths. They signal that you are a member of a certain party, right? Like, it's a kind of person with a kind of education that says the word transphobia. It's a kind of person whose mind is made up that says the word anti-vaxxer.
Hmm.
And so when you use the less specialty word, you're kind of, it's like centrist virtue signaling or something, right? Like, you're signaling to the audience that, like, oh, I am an independent free thinker. I'm putting things in my own words because these are just my ideas that I came up with myself.
You're entering with an open mind. It sort of can signal, which can
Yeah.
be useful in having some of these conversations. Okay,
Uh-huh.
let's talk a little bit, if we apply that to your videos that you've done on fascism, on the alt-right. I mean, I think it might be useful as we get into this topic. First and foremost, when we talk about fascism, what's a sort of useful working definition that will serve us in exploring this issue in more detail?
Well, I guess I avoid like defining a word like fascism too directly, but I think a working definition would be like politics that's kind of primarily motivated by a kind of national or ethno um, in-group, out-group sentiment. So if the primary motivation for your politics is sort of preserving the boundaries of an ethno-group, of a national group, that to me is fascist politics. I guess there's other attributes too. Like, it pretty much always goes along with like very reactionary views about women and about sort of social issues. It pretty much always goes along with some degree of like militancy or tendency towards violence. It tends to go along with a kind of authoritarianism or sort of worship of a dictator or leader. Um, but to me, the core issue is the like this idea of treating a society almost like an organism, like treating it like this sort of being prone to infection, where
So
infection is to be understood as outsiders.
in thinking about that, I mean, I've interviewed a lot of former and active, I guess I would say, white nationalists, extremists, neo Nazis, and in talking to the formers, typically when I asked them about how they were pulled into the ideology and the movements of white nationalism or neo Nazism or whatever, it's almost exclusively an answer about family situation, what their life was like growing up, the particulars of seeing a group that was appealing to them for the community, and the beliefs sort of came with it and they accepted them with different degrees of actual belief. So if we step back a little bit from the individual stories that might be out there about how people get pulled into these ideologies, at a more like societal level, what do you believe is appealing about the sort of fascism, maybe light fascism in the sense of authoritarianism, nationalism, etc.? What is attractive about that to people from a philosophical perspective?
Well, I think fascism provides people with a strong sense of identity, and that sort of goes along with what you're saying about the fact that this type of politics tends to be attractive to people who are sort of lost and not, they're sort of trying to find themselves. They want acceptance. They want to feel like they're part of a group. They want to feel like they're part of a collective that's working towards something. They want to feel like they know who they are and can make sense of their own individual identity and where they fit into society. And I think that against a background of the kind of like really like sort of meaningless capitalism that we have, and by when I say meaningless capitalism, I mean that like the sort of pre-made value system that our society hands to people is very sort of materialistic. It's very sort of almost like frivolously like consumerist and so on. And that leaves people, so some people find like a consumer identity as like a gamer or something. But for a lot of people, that's like not enough, especially if they're in a rough employment situation or they're just impoverished. They have family problems, like you say, like they're not succeeding by the metrics of our society, right? They're not. So they want to know, like, who am I? What am I? What is my value? Like, where do I fit in this world? And fascism has easy answers to all those questions. It says you are the sort of descendant of this like noble European heritage, and you are the descendant of Voltaire and of Christopher Columbus and all this great stuff that the European West has accomplished. And that offers people, I think, a sense of pride, a sense of identity, a sense of worth, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. And all that stuff is very, very attractive. It's hard to contend with a movement that's offering people all of that.
And though I can't help but think that for some people, similar sort of circumstances of feeling lost and most everything else you're describing could lead someone, and does, to say, I think that, for example, socialism is the right path forward. I think that. So is there anything that we can identify that might push someone more towards one side or the other, be it psychologically, be it maybe by virtue of what country you're in?
Well, I think that one of the ways fascism works is it preys on resentments and sort of ignorance and insecurities that are already there. So, I mean, to me, the alt-right was like fascinating in terms of how sort of psychologically open it was, like how like almost embarrassingly honest. Like, I remember when they were using the word cuck all the time.
Yeah.
That first started in like 2015, 2016. Like, it almost like it sort of made me gasp that we were being like so like sexually transparent about the like deep motivations for this. Like, there's this anxiety about masculinity and about women and about white women in particular, and this anxiety about sort of the replacement of white men by immigrant men. And like, I think that those kinds of things are sort of there in the background. And I think men tend to be very susceptible to fascism because it offers a kind of masculinist gender politics that is sort of attractive to men who feel that the society that we're in is actually kind of like emasculating. And I think that is sort of a common feeling that a lot of internet subgroups have, like what we call the manosphere, incels, sort of the kind of college-aged boys who get really into Jordan Peterson, for example. There's a deep insecurity about masculinity there, and a sort of sexual insecurity. And fascism actually offers a really kind of attractive package to that set of worries.
That's a perfect spot, actually, which will lead us into part 2 of the interview, which will start to connect the Donald Trump administration and some of the movements that are surrounding it. So let's pause our conversation there with Natalie Wynn, video essayist, progressive commentator. You may know her from the YouTube channel Contrapoints, now with 500,000 subscribers, and we will continue our conversation there. We're continuing our conversation today with Natalie Wynn, a video essayist and progressive commentator with 500,000 subscribers to her YouTube channel, Contrapoints. We're going to continue our conversation about fascism and authoritarianism, and I want to now start to tie in some of your analysis about not only the alt-right now in 2018, 2019, and in sort of recent electoral politics, but also the connection to Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies. Do you think, or let me frame it in this way. When I interviewed white nationalist Richard Spencer, and I said to him, what exactly is it that you expect from Trump? Do you actually expect him to say, down with the Jews or get white people out or whatever? And Richard Spencer, I think, was pretty genuine in that he said, no, we don't have any expectations of that. It's basically that we recognize that more than any other recent president, Trump seems indifferent to, or at least okay, allowing an atmosphere where white nationalism and the resurgence of neo-Nazism sort of has a better shot than it's had. Is that as far as you would go in thinking about the connection of the Trump administration to these movements, or would you actually take it further than that?
I would go further. First of all, I think that that's correct. Like, I think that a lot of the reason that so many people who are white nationalists love Donald Trump is that Donald Trump is very cautious never to sort of intrude too much on their space, to never really condemn directly any of the things they believe. And that leaves room for them always to think that he might secretly be on their side. But more than that, I mean, I think like I've seen white nationalists call Trump like the strongest like symbol of white identity we have. And I think that a lot of that has to do with like the central marketing basically of his campaign, this like build the wall thing. Well, the wall is like almost a childishly, laughably primitive symbol of like wanting to protect an in-group from an out-group. And I don't think anyone who voted for Trump really cares that much about the physical wall. I think what they care about is the sentiment behind the slogan, build the wall. It means shut outsiders away. It means keep America American, and we know what that means. So I think that it's more than just his silence. It's more than just saying that there are good people on both sides in Charlottesville. You know, it's also the fact that his messaging is kind of the diet version of Richard Spencer's messaging.
So you mentioned a couple of the data points. There's, Mexicans are rapists and criminals, although some I'm sure are good people. There's total and complete shutdown of, as I think he pronounced it, Muslims coming to the United States. What other data points do you look at that are either coded or more overt language that is signaling to these extremist groups?
Well, I mean, attacking Antifa is a pretty obvious one. I think that just his whole campaigning on like America first, make America great again, which is like, I mean, who wants to make America, for what group of people was America better in the past? Like white people. Everyone knows that. I think that all of these things kind of each of his major talking points is in some way laced with an element that is going to be sort of attractive to people who like white nationalism. He did a speech in Poland that I think this must have been the first year of his presidency. And he talks, I think this was Stephen Miller, I think was the speech, but it was, he's talking about literally just talking about defending the West from the barbarians. Like, it's not even dog whistles anymore. It's like literally what the white nationalists will say.
Are any of the so-called threats that the current sort of alt-right white nationalist Venn diagram group, however it overlaps on any particular day, are any of the threats they claim to be facing even remotely defensible? That of, white genocide is just absolutely outrageous, but the idea of possible loss of some kind of status for so-called European Americans, the invasion of immigration, as they like to describe it. I mean, is there anything that even has like a grain of empirical defensibility?
Well, I do think that for like again the kind of college age white boy demographic, there is this sense that, that group of people just used to be able to assume themselves as the default. Like they assumed they were going to get jobs because society was going to provide them jobs. That's how they were raised. They were raised to expect that. They were just used to being represented as the default in media. They were used to Star Wars movies where all the main characters are white men or designed to be perceived by white men. And then suddenly there's this huge cultural shift. Suddenly women and people of color and gender and sexual minorities are making demands and asserting themselves and appearing in media and getting jobs. And so there's this loss of the default status, which I mean, in some ways it must hurt a little bit. Like, I think that I can understand why it feels like they're losing something. Like, I think they are losing something. I mean, I think it's something that they didn't deserve in the first place and needs to go. And I think they need to recognize that, but I still get why it feels like a loss.
Yeah, so in other words, they may be claiming that a situation that was a level playing field is becoming one in which they are disadvantaged, when if there is a change in status, what accurately seems to describe it would be that what was previously a privileged status may end up with a more level playing field.
Well, there's a slogan, I guess, that describes it. I can't remember the exact wording, but basically the effect is that to the privileged person, equality feels like oppression.
I think I've seen that, and I think that much more succinctly than I was able to say it sort of sums it up. When it comes to individual extremists, white nationalists, whoever, I'm curious what your sense is of the platforming or interviewing of some of those individuals. So to kind of set it up for you, my audience is very much aware of this. Over the last many years on my program, I have selectively interviewed extremists of different kinds. And usually I apply like a 2 or 3 part kind of test to whether it's a good idea. Number one is, are they and their ideas prominent enough that there would be some value in refuting and exposing them? That would be number one. Number two, do I feel as though I am either prepared enough or could be prepared enough to responsibly platform them such that it doesn't become an opportunity for them to actually propagandize? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, I've made the decision in the past to interview people like Richard Spencer or the Westboro Baptist Church when they were relevant, or whoever else. Given all of that I've just said, what's your kind of general philosophy on the providing of a platform, even if it is one that is not an unfettered platform to propagandize to extremists?
Well, I think I basically agree with what you're describing as the sort of like tests that you need to go through to decide if it's a good idea. I've been very, very critical in the past of people who have interviewed Richard Spencer, for example, and then just kind of sat there nodding along as he spouts incredibly toxic white nationalist propaganda. So I think it, in part, it has to do with the like personality of the interviewer and whether or not you feel that sort of holding your own and keeping this person accountable in front of an audience is something that you can do effectively. So I think that what I agree with what you're saying. Like, there's absolutely no point in profiling a dangerous crackpot with no following, because you're just going to give them attention. And then if you're going to profile a high-profile person with extremely toxic and dangerous ideas, then you have to be prepared to challenge them and to really, to really ask the very, very difficult questions that they're not, that are going to sort of expose the reality of what that person is saying. So this is not something I do myself, in part because my temperament is not aggressive enough to do it, and in part because I am a trans woman, and my comrades on the left do not tolerate that from me.
Oh, well, okay. So I want to hear more. So you're saying that because of your identity as a trans woman, you feel that other leftists wouldn't tolerate you interviewing extremists at all, or in the way that your personality would lend itself to those interviews?
Well, I think it's just not the role for me. and I think that it's sort of complicated, the reasons why. I mean, one of them has to do with the fact that in order to do it properly, you have to be a little bit combative. To be combative is a masculine posture,
Hmm.
and if a trans woman adopts a masculine posture, she always loses.
That's very interesting. And so I'm curious whether, is this something people have said to you and you've made the conscious decision not to do those types of interviews? Or is this sort of something that you've surmised from your observations as to how people react to your channel?
Well, this was something that I kind of went through, a year and a half ago, where basically it was something that was surmised based on people's reactions. Like, I had done sort of I had, I didn't really interview people. That was never what I did online. But I would even I would go onto right wing platforms and try to be a person who challenged it. Now, maybe some of the objection to me was that people felt I wasn't a strong enough debater, that I wasn't able to really do that responsibly.
Hmm.
But it always was a little weird to me that I was accused of platforming people whose platforms I was appearing on.
Yeah, I think I saw a conversation you had with this gentleman named Carl Benjamin, who might be better known to the audience
Yeah.
as a Sargon of Akkad. And yeah, I mean, I think, the appearing on other programs also there's always a question mark around the kind of framing and context in which the conversation will be happening and whether
Yeah.
there's kind of a net gain to be had. And I think the calculation is different for everybody in those cases.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't think that as I said, it's complicated. It's not just that felt I was shut down by other people. I do feel obviously a little bit hurt about that, but I acknowledge that I was not the greatest debater myself. So, but nor was I given the space to develop the skill.
So I'm curious, I mean, aside from individual decisions around platforming of oneself elsewhere or of others on one's platform, what in your mind are the best sort of insulators that allow people to resist the appeal of some of these fascist, authoritarian, alt-right, nationalist type ideas? I mean, is it just as simple as we've got to start teaching critical thinking in middle school, or is there really more to it?
Well, I think it's more than just critical thinking, because critical thinking, well, that involves a lot of different stuff. I mean, sometimes critical thinking is just like how to analyze graphs, how to analyze data.
Sure.
I think that is important, but I think that a lot of times these arguments are so heavily based on sort of an emotional hook that it's really like a statistician would fall for them, because it's not about numbers, it's about feelings. And to me, I think that one of the things that's a protective shield is having some kind of personal connection to people who are likely to be deeply hurt by that politics. So I think that there's a kind of, social isolation. Like, I think that, as a trans person, this is something I experienced a lot on YouTube, where, one of the reasons why the right wing has taken to using trans people as this punching bag is that most people don't know a trans person. So people are sort of ignorant. Trans people are confusing. No one gets it. And so we're sort of easy to hate on, because like no one's going to come to our defense because they don't know enough to come to our defense. And I think that one of the things that I try to accomplish just by being a somewhat high profile person on the internet is to just be like, hi, like I'm here, I'm human, I'm relatable. Like, you don't want to do things that are going to be hurt me in politics.
I
And
mean, I agree
think
with you
that,
completely, but it's
yeah,
also one of the most depressing
yeah,
realities. And when I see, you hear about Republican senator rethinks view on gay marriage because their son has come out as gay. Okay, great. Like
yeah.
count someone who now has taken the correct position, but it's very depressing that only when it affects them in such an acute way do they actually rethink how this is affecting people.
It's depressing how little imagination people have to to be a career homophobe and a politician, to have just never once thought, what if my son was gay? Like, how can you have not thought that?
Yeah, and of
It's
course the
sad.
other
Yeah.
side of that is, if views that you thought were so logical and correct and deeply held are so quickly changed as soon as you have a personal connection to the issue, maybe that suggests some of your other views aren't as rock solid as you might imagine.
Yeah, it's right. Your views about race, your views about gender, it's I guess misogyny is kind of the one outlier here, because men who know women seem to have no difficulty hating them.
Yeah, that one is different. That is an interesting one.
Yeah. It's different. Yeah.
We have been speaking with Natalie Wynn, who is a video essayist and progressive commentator. Don't miss her YouTube channel, Contrapoints, with 500,000 subscribers. Natalie, I really appreciate your time and you talking to me today.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me on.